Our speaker today, a very timely topic, is Dr. Erin Miller from the START Center at the University of Maryland. And Erin will be giving us an overview of the Global Terrorism Database, how it works, what they're looking at, what the big issues are right now. And then she will be followed by two discussants, both from Department of Homeland Security. Paige Schilling is an intelligence ops specialist with intelligence and analysis at DHS headquarters in Washington, D.C. And many of you know Mike Matthews, who is our very own Nevada Protective Security Agent for DHS CISA. So with that, we will get started. So I will turn it over to Erin. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate the invitation from NSF. I'm sharing my screen here so you can see my slides. So yes, thanks for the introduction. My name is Erin Miller, and I manage a project called the Global Terrorism Database at the University of Maryland. The research organization that I work for is called START. It stands for the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. And START is a DHS Emeritus Center of Excellence. So it was a center of excellence originally stood up in 2005 to study the social science angles of the causes and consequences of terrorism. And the Global Terrorism Database is really the foundational project that START was built on. The GTD actually predates START by a few years. So my goals for this morning's presentation are to talk a little bit about the Global Terrorism Database, to give you some background about what it is, how we collect it, what we do with the data, how others use the data. I'm sure Paige and Mike will expand on that piece of things as well. But the general background about what the GTD is. And then I want to focus a little bit on what current challenges exist for analysts who are collecting and using the GTD. What are the tricky questions that we're facing in 2021? I imagine you can guess on a few of them, but we'll talk in a bit more detail about that. And then we're always working to build and expand and improve and evolve the research that we do, the data collection that we do. So I want to finish by touching a little bit on what our plans are for some future research that we're just getting started on. So just some background on the Global Terrorism Database. Some of you may be familiar with it already. It's an open source database. It's based entirely on media accounts of terrorist attacks. So anything published in open source media around the world. It includes domestic and international attacks, and it goes back to 1970. Right now, the data are currently updated through 2019. We've actually experienced some funding gaps recently that have caused lags in the data collection process, but we are picking up with the data collection. We just recently resumed data collection. We're working on the 2020 data collection right now. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's the information in the database is what you would expect to see in media articles. So a lot of detail on when the attacks happened, where the attacks happened, tactics, perpetrators, weapons, outcomes. And at the moment, we have records of more than 200,000 terrorist attacks that have happened all around the world back to 1970. Obviously, one of the most important aspects of collecting data on terrorism is defining terrorism, and that is certainly a contentious topic that we could spend weeks or months discussing, but I'll be brief about what our working definition of terrorism is, and that is acts by non-state actors involving the threatened or actual use of illegal force or violence to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. That's sort of the short version of the definition. We go to great lengths to develop specific inclusion criteria for actually applying that definition to real world events. And we document those criteria as well as possible and provide that information about how we define terms and how we make decisions about including or not including certain events in the Global Terrorism Database Codebook, which is available on our website. A little bit about the team that collects the database. So the project started at the University of Maryland in 2002. I've actually worked on it since 2004 in various capacities. The team of people that we have currently working on the project have a combined more than 50 years of experience working specifically on the global terrorism database as a project. We have a variety of social science backgrounds, largely criminology and political science, but also public policy and geography. And the analysts include people who hold PhDs and master's degrees. We have a dedicated computer scientist who has built us data collection tools that manage the entire data collection process from beginning to end. And we recruit cohorts of students working on the database collection project. So each semester we have a recruitment effort to bring in students from the University of Maryland, but also really around the country, and in some cases even outside of the US, to work on the various aspects of the data collection process. We've come a long way. This is actually what the original data collection process looked like. So from 1970 to 1997, these records were recorded by PGIS, the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, and they were handwritten on these 5x7 index cards. The project at the University of Maryland started when Gary Lafree, who's the original principal investigator for the project, sort of inherited these archival storage boxes that you see in the bottom right-hand corner there that included about 50 to 60,000 of these index cards. You can see the top one is from an attack in 1979 in Northern Ireland. The target was a train. It was an attack on transportation involving an explosive device. There's a note there at the bottom of the card that says, stopped train just after it crossed the border from the Irish Republic. 2 charges in milk churns were placed in the engine, and the railroad bridge was blocked with 4 hijacked trucks. The device exploded and buckled to the main line between Belfast and Dublin. And the source for that information is a Reuters article from the 21st of April in 1979. And so for a lot of the earlier cases, that's basically the amount of information, the level of detail that we have. The second card there is actually the index card for the Oklahoma City attack in 1995. So you can see the data collection method evolved a little bit, but there's still a lot of ambiguity in terms of things being written down and scratched out. The perpetrator group that there at the bottom references right-wing extremists question mark. And there's some question about the number of people who were killed or injured in the margins there. So our first task was to digitize all of this information into a database. In many cases, we tried to update the information as much as we were able to. But we've come a long way since the days of handwritten index cards and the sort of messy handwriting. All of our data collection methods right now are online. We have a data management system that we use. We start with a subscription access to news aggregators, so like LexisNexis and BBC Monitoring, that produce more than 2 million articles a day on average. That is our starting point. It's sort of our haystack. All of these news articles published around the world on any given topic. And our goal is to find the news articles in this very, very large pool that describe terrorist attacks, that have information about terrorist attacks that we can use in the data collection process. And so what we do is we balance artificial intelligence steps with human intelligence steps to try and maximize the effectiveness and the efficiency of both of those, because humans certainly can't read 2 million articles a day, and machines really aren't very good at deciding what a terrorist attack is. So we try and balance those two aspects of technology and methodology to be efficient, but we're always looking for new ways to reliably lean on artificial intelligence more to increase the efficiency of the process, but without compromising the quality, the accuracy of the data. So from those 2 million articles a day, we start off with a number of AI tasks that are aimed at just whittling that pool down into something that's a little more manageable for our human team to review and read. We use regular search filters to weed out obviously irrelevant content. So a lot of articles, if we're looking for articles that reference the word shooting, we want to discard the ones that might be about sports. So basketball references often involve shooting, and an article might involve the word bombing, but we want to discard anything that is just about movies or TV shows or things like that. So it's a very rough cut initially. We use natural language processing to remove duplicate articles. So it basically sort of takes a fingerprint of the words in the article and compares it to all of the other articles, and we'll remove any articles that are duplicate, but we'll keep the most recent version of the article in case there's a small differentiation with new information that's been added to it when a news article might be sort of syndicated or republished over and over again. And we also use the natural language processing to cluster articles together so that when our analysts are reading them, they're reading articles that are about similar topics. They're not bouncing around between reading an article about Pakistan and then reading an article about Baghdad and then reading an article about Pittsburgh. And we try to organize the articles into clusters using natural language processing techniques. And then the last part of the AI steps for the process is our machine learning model. So we've developed a machine learning model. We actually started using this in 2012. And it works a lot like a spam filter, right? It's basically classifying articles into those that are relevant to terrorism, those that have information about terrorist attacks, and those that don't have information about terrorist attacks. So like your spam filter is trying to say, this is spam, this is not spam, and you can correct it. You can update the information in the filter. You can say, no, you thought that was spam, but it's not spam, or vice versa. We do that with the machine learning model that we use to determine whether or not there's a likelihood that the news article includes relevant information about terrorism. So we continually update that and give it feedback. And then our human team starts by reading through those articles that are identified as those most likely to have relevant information about terrorist attacks. And that ranges very widely from month to month in terms of how many articles are left out of that 2 million that we start out with. How many articles are left that are potentially relevant to our data collection efforts. It's been in the past as many as over 30,000 articles in a month that we have to figure out strategies to get through. That was a peak that we observed in, I think, 2014, when there's some really major attacks carried out by Islamic State, was highly active. And carrying out major attacks that just generated quite a lot of media content. But it's also been as low as, closer to 5,000 a month. So it varies a lot depending on how much terrorism is happening at any given time, and how much media coverage those events are getting. And once those events are identified, that staff will identify the attacks that meet our inclusion criteria for the definition of terrorism. Our students, our teams of students, will work to fill in the blanks on as much detail as possible. So there are more than 100 variables in the GTD about different types of information, and they will go through the supporting articles that are attached, that are linked to a particular attack record, and make decisions about the details of the attack. They'll deal with conflicting information and try and make consistent decisions and capture the information about what happened. And that's something that machines just aren't very good at, for dealing with that sort of ambiguity and conflicting information. This is just a little bit more about what information is currently included in the Global Terrorism Database. So these are the 5 domain sort of segments that we have broken our code book into, and you can see a lot more information and detail about this in the Global Terrorism Database code book. But the domains are locations information, perpetrators information, targets information, weapons and tactics, and then casualties and consequences information. And we have little teams of students working on each of these sort of slices of the database so that they can sort of develop a familiarity with, for example, perpetrator groups that are responsible and the different naming conventions of perpetrator groups, and the people who are worried about, you know, the data collectors who are worried about how to name a perpetrator group or be consistent about that. They don't have to worry about what the difference is between, you know, a firebomb and an explosive device, an incendiary device, because the weapons and tactics team focuses on all of that, and the casualties and consequences team will focus on, you know, what do we do if there's conflicting information about how many people were killed or injured during an attack. And so we sort of have a little, you know, subject matter specialization even within the broader data collection effort. When the data is all collected, we put it on our website. You can go to our website at start.umd.edu/GTD and access the data itself. We think this is a really important part of our mission, is producing the data and making it available as widely as possible to users to learn from it, to understand trends and patterns. I'll talk a little bit more about the different sort of segments of our user community. Academics and scholars and students are a big part of it. So if you look for the references to Global Terrorism Database on Google Scholar, there's more than 8,000 references in sort of academic pieces and articles over the years. And so that's certainly been increasing, and it's heavily relied on by students and researchers who produce work that then others can hopefully benefit from as well. In terms of government analysts and policymakers, I'll certainly defer to Paige and Mike on this a bit, but this is just a selection of some of the agencies, federal, state, and local agencies in the United States and around the world who rely on the Global Terrorism Database to better understand patterns of terrorism. The ones that are listed there above the line are actually those agencies who have at some point funded the Global Terrorism Database project. So DOJ, Homeland Security, Department of State, and Department of Defense have in the past funded the data collection effort. Currently, we're actually funded only by Auswärtiges Amt, which is the German Federal Foreign Office, and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So we as I mentioned earlier, we've had some ongoing challenges with maintaining stable funding and consistent funding for the data collection process. And right now we are working, we just resumed the data collection thanks to some short-term funding from the German government and the UK government. In the category of sort of NGOs and IGOs and think tanks, there's a wide variety of organizations that have relied on the database and the GTD at one point or another. The use cases here are a bit varied as well. So some of these organizations will rely on the database for analysis to produce analytical reports and policy recommendations. In some cases, though, for example, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, they actually have in the past used the GTD in a more applied sense in terms of identifying the safest routes for personnel who are active in conflict zones or in areas where there is a high likelihood of terrorism. So it's a more practical use case in certain situations. I work with the media a lot to leverage the GTD in reports and stories about patterns of terrorism. This often happens in the aftermath of major attacks. For example, we will field requests for information from the media, and part of my objective is to make sure that the media is representing the patterns in the data in an appropriate way, and recognizing sort of the strengths of the data set, but also the limitations of what can and cannot be supported by by the data that we have, or more importantly, in some cases, what data we happen to be missing. And then finally, the last sort of category of GTD users is that we've been learning more about is the private sector. And so a lot of private sector companies rely on the GTD, again, for a variety of types of use cases. In some situations, it is analytical risk assessments. In the case of the insurance companies, there are insurance companies who are working to better understand the risks of terrorist attacks and what that means for terrorism insurance and reinsurance rates and likelihoods and things like that. In other cases, someone might just be using the GTD, for example, Esri or Tableau to demonstrate their product. It's a really rich, robust data set, and it can be useful for sort of illustrating the utility of a data manipulation or data visualization product, for example. And then there are also some tactical uses as well in the private sector in terms of physical security. So there are certain companies that have physical security interests and again use the global terrorism database to evaluate the risks and make security decisions. So the data itself, the latest data that we have completed for a full year is 2019. So this is sort of just a really quick overview of the latest 2019 data. You can see that there are certainly concentrations of attacks in particular locations, and some of those locations that they coincide with conflict areas where there's sort of a broader political violence conflict going on, and terrorism is just one aspect of it. These are the trends, the monthly trends for the past few years going back to 2012. You can see in 2014, there's that peak that I mentioned with respect to the peak of activity by the Islamic State, the violence carried out by Islamic State that year was just particularly horrific and extreme. And we've seen declining numbers really since then, since the fall of the Islamic State Caliphate that had been really driving the global numbers pretty heavily. Since then, we've seen a steady decline since the fall of the Caliphate that has been ongoing. Now, it's important to recognize that these global trends are a very poor representation of specific regional trends. So anyone who's familiar with specific areas will recognize that the global trend does not necessarily reflect what is going on in particular areas or particular conflict zones. And in many cases, the global trend is made up of a mixture of places where terrorism is increasing and places where terrorism is decreasing, and they're all very important in contextual considerations to take into account. So for example, if you focus specifically on Afghanistan during that same time period where the global trend is declining because of the decline of the Islamic State Caliphate, you see Afghanistan has this very cyclical, seasonal pattern of terrorism that has really continued to increase over this time period, not only during this time period, but during peace talks between the Taliban and the US government. And so it's interesting to see maybe the increase in the attacks in Afghanistan has leveled off a bit. The rate of increase has leveled off a bit, but it has still increased and continues to be a very volatile situation. And when we're looking towards the future as the peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghanistan government are continuing, we actually, in our preliminary data for 2020, it does appear that the violence is continuing to increase as well. And I think that if you're reading the news on how these peace talks are going, you'll see that there has been no sort of noticeable decline in the levels of violence in Afghanistan and levels of terrorist violence in Afghanistan as these negotiations are ongoing. Another sort of more long-standing trend that we've been looking at is the activity by sort of key movements, including the Al-Qaeda movement, and the Islamic State movement. And by movement, I mean sort of the broader group or network of organizations, sort of the core organization, affiliated organizations that have sort of varying degrees of strength of relationship to the core, but also individuals who have no meaningful relationship with the core organization, but are inspired by their objectives and their goals, and might not have direct contact, but are carrying out attacks in their name. So we sort of combined all of those together for both Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And this is a graph, these are two graphs really, of the number of countries that these movements, that these networks have carried out attacks in over the years. And you can see certainly the geographic expansion of Al-Qaeda in the top graph, the gray and black graph, was much more gradual, while the geographic expansion of Islamic State in the bottom graph, the sort of pink and red version, was very rapid. But obviously that's partly due to the fact that that Islamic State kind of got a head start from sort of being an outcropping of Al-Qaeda, but you can see really how rapidly the number of countries increased. The cumulative number of countries that have experienced Islamic State attacks seems to be continuing to increase, even as the number of countries in any given year has started to decrease as the overall level of activity of Islamic State related organizations and individuals has declined, but they're still sort of moving into new areas each year. We're seeing a geographic expansion of their activity. Another sort of ongoing and issue that we've noticed recent trends in is the number of racially and ethnically motivated terrorist attacks. In 2019, we did see a pretty sharp increase in the lethality of these attacks. In particular, there were certainly key attacks that were racially and ethnically motivated, targeting Muslims in New Zealand and also in El Paso, targeting Hispanic people in El Paso. And so that's certainly something that we are noticing a sort of local increase in over recent years, and will continue to track as well. So to the current challenges, 2021, and what are the things that our team, our analysts are paying attention to and focusing on. I think it probably goes without saying that one of the big ones is COVID-19. Who among us is not facing COVID-19 related challenges? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what the landscape looks like for the relationship between COVID-19 and terrorism. And there has been a lot of ink spilled on this topic. It's all, I think, very interesting. And there's a lot of sort of speculation and hypothesizing about what the potential impacts are, the ways in which COVID-19 will impact patterns of terrorism. For example, one of my former colleagues who used to be at the University of Maryland is now at Albany, Gary Ackerman, and one of his colleagues wrote an article on 10 possible ways that COVID-19 could impact terrorism. So it's really important to, I think, appreciate that there are a lot of potentially competing mechanisms here that could be important. Ackerman and Peterson focus on a pretty wide variety of them, ranging from the possibility that COVID-19 could be potentially used as a weapon and weaponized as a new type of tactic in terms of using COVID-19 specifically to cause harm, all the way to another end of the spectrum that focuses more on the fact that security resources are spread very thin because of the effects of COVID-19, and that could have an impact on the security of potential targets of terrorism. But there are a variety of different perspectives on this. Some say that maybe the immediate impact is a decrease in the number of attacks, but it could be short-lived. Some others are sort of urging to be very balanced about the and not overstate the potential effect of COVID-19 on terrorism. There's a bit more in terms of, so Interpol released a report suggesting that terrorist groups would use COVID-19 to do recruiting, to do more recruiting and use it as a sort of a tool of radicalization. The UN has a report suggesting that the Security Council is anticipating an increase in extremist activity due to COVID-19. And you can imagine the different mechanisms that would lead to an increase or a decrease, right? And on one hand, it could be an opportunity for recruiting and for radicalization. On the other hand, you know, a lot of the fears about attacks, sort of mass casualty attacks on crowded events, on concerts, on, you know, restaurants, a lot of the targets that we've actually seen in the past being major potential targets of terrorist attacks aren't really happening at the moment, right? The types of crowded events aren't happening as much. Now, that's not to say that other types of crowded events aren't also happening, right? That it could just be the potential for a shift in the type of tactics or the type of targeting, but it's definitely something to sort of be on the lookout for in terms of brainstorming out the possible ways that different patterns of behavior among the populations around the world could create different sort of targeting incentives for potential assailants. And then there are some situations where the actual pandemic itself has led to certain types of attacks. So, for example, you may remember last year a train engineer derailed a train near the hospital ship Mercy because he had sort of bought into these completely unsubstantiated conspiracy theories, and fortunately he was nowhere near actually colliding with the train. But in addition to that, we've seen dozens and dozens of attacks on 5G cell towers and even other cell towers that aren't 5G towers, but people mistakenly think are 5G towers because of this unsubstantiated conspiracy theory about the links between 5G cell signals and COVID-19 in particular. So there's been a dramatic increase in the number of attacks all throughout Europe and in some cases in the United States linked to these COVID-19 related grievances. Another of the second sort of challenge that I'll focus on in terms of what we're focusing on right now is protest-related violence. It certainly goes without saying, I think, that protest-related violence is not a new phenomenon, but it seems to have had a bit of a resurgence in the past few years. And I think the first thing that I'll say is that it's really important to understand that most protest-related violence is not terrorism. Certainly protest is not terrorism, but even violence that sort of breaks out or erupts during protests is not what we would consider terrorism or terrorist attacks according to the GTD definitions of terrorism. And so a couple sort of examples in recent years that we saw a lot of protests in Hong Kong. We saw a lot of protests, the Yellow Vest protests in Paris, and earlier this year, the racial justice protests in the United States. I shouldn't say earlier this year, I guess it was last year and in recent years. And so we pay a lot of attention to these, but the vast majority of situations, even where violence sort of spontaneously breaks out, we wouldn't consider terrorism, we wouldn't include in the global terrorism database. And so that is one of the limitations. If you're interested in the broader spectrum of protest violence, the global terrorism database is not a good source of information for that because we're focused on terrorism. Now, we do really want to identify situations, however, where terrorist attacks can take place sort of against the backdrop of a protest event. And there certainly are cases where that happens. I think perhaps most recently, we're all aware of the January 6th attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And so what are some of the things that we look for when we are trying to make a determination of whether a terrorist attack happened at a protest or there's a terrorist attack happened against the backdrop of a protest? So the three key things we look for, and the more information we have about these, the easier it is for us to make a decision, but it's not always easy, to say the least. But the three things that we do look for are evidence of planning And by planning, I don't mean planning a protest, right? There can be plenty of evidence of planning a protest, but we're looking for evidence of planning a specific attack, and specific indication that the attack was sort of premeditated and intentional, that there's sort of an intentionality to the actions that were taken, rather than just sort of a spontaneous, we were protesting and there's sort of a swell of hostility and anger, and it was sort of reactionary, but a purposeful, intentional, planned attack on a specific place. Another thing that we look for is the weapons. We're looking for weapons that are not necessarily just readily available, that might be lying around. So if someone picks up a brick and throws it through a window, that's not the kind that sort of suggests a more spontaneous type of attack, rather than if someone went to the trouble of crafting a pipe bomb and brought it to the event to carry out a bombing attack. And then the last sort of major piece of the puzzle that we look for evidence of in terms of determining what we would include in the database is there indication of specific targeting, and how clear is it that there was a specific target rather than a spontaneous, again, there happened to be this building nearby and it was damaged in the violence of the protest, but is there specific indication of a clear and discrete target? In the case of the attack on the Capitol, certainly the Capitol itself was a target of the attack, but there's also some information, and this is all still very sort of preliminary, and we learn more and more, I think, every day about what happened. But there's some indication that the specific lawmakers may have been targeted in that attack. And the ultimate sort of takeaway that I think is also important to remember is, when we're making this determination for the purpose of the Global Terrorism Database, we like to wait for as much information to come out as possible. We're not really in the business of making the first decision. This is all based on open source information, so we're reading the news just like everyone else is, and we recognize, of course, that these things evolve considerably over time. We learn more about what happened on each of these different dimensions, and so we'll include that in our decision-making process for exactly how this type of attack will appear in the Global Terrorism Database. So what's coming next? I want to wrap up quickly and just talk a little bit about some work that we're doing. So we just got underway on a project that we're calling Terrorism and Targeted Violence in the United States. This is funded by the Department of Homeland Security. It's focused only on the United States, and so it's a distinct project from the Global Terrorism Database project, but we're obviously leveraging a lot of our experience and expertise carrying out the Global Terrorism Database data collection and analysis in this project. But we're focusing on the United States. We're expanding, even though it's geographically more focused, we're expanding beyond just terrorism and including other types of targeted violence in the United States. And we'll be working on data collection, data analysis, and building a dissemination platform. We're in the very early sort of planning stages of this project, and focusing on setting up stakeholder working group meetings. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the brainstorming that we've been doing on ways to build on the information that is already collected in the Global Terrorism Database and add additional context and details. And so there are a few aspects of this. One is more context and details about the assailants that were active in the attack. Specifically, was there a link between the assailants and the target? Was there some sort of pre-existing either workplace or school or some sort of ability for the assailant to have like insider access to the target that would make it more difficult to prevent? What was the extent of planning and preparation? Did it take a few days? Did it take a few weeks? Did it take a few years? Were there any ideological symbols specifically referenced, right? These are things that we don't specifically capture in the Global Terrorism Database right now, but we often see information about this in the news articles that we read about these attacks. Another one is, were there any statements made in advance? So this is often referred to as leakage, or sort of, the assailant is talking either on social media or to people they know about their intentions to carry out the attack. And then was the assailant part of a broader ideological movement? So we're struggling a little bit with characterizing the organizations that are active in carrying out terrorist attacks, because assailants, I think these days, are a little bit more loosely organized and part of, in some cases, broader ideological movements rather than very formal organizations. We're also looking at more information about the tactics and gathering more information about things like, was there an intention to target a crowd of people? Was there evidence of stockpiling weapons beforehand? And are these things that can be used to learn more about ways to potentially prevent these types of attacks? Is there additional information that we can possibly get about weapon details? We already do collect a lot of information about the weapons, but we might be able to go a little bit more deeply on that to gather more detail about the information, about the weapons information. One key factor that seems important, particularly for first responders and planning responses, is, was the assailant intending to plan an escape from the attack? And that might be a really important differentiator, because it entirely changes the landscape of the response from first responders in terms of, are they spending a lot of resources? Do they have to devote a lot of resources to tracking down the assailant or not? And to what extent does that impact the overall outcomes of the attack? And then, like I said, we have a lot of information on weapons that were used, but we don't currently collect much information on the use of sort of tactical gear or other types of equipment that might be important for responders to know about. So we're interested in expanding the types of information we collect on that. And then finally, the outcomes of the attack. So we already have, again, quite a lot of information on the casualties, but we'd like to better be able to capture potential impacts on critical infrastructure, sometimes related to that, potential impacts on service interruptions. So were transportation networks down, were communication networks down for any period of time? We'll look at capturing more specific location coordinates about the locations of the attack, whether or not an attack required a multi-jurisdictional response, because that in some cases is a real difference maker in the complexity of the response for first responders. And then finally, more information about the types of injuries. So we do include the number of people who were injured, but there's a very wide variation in smoke inhalation versus the loss of limbs or very serious injuries. And so if we're able to gather, there are actually some medical personnel who use the GTD, so ER personnel have written journal articles about their experience dealing with victims of terrorism. And I think more information about the types of injuries that we have, in many cases, we have access to in the source articles, but we're not currently documenting particularly well. But if we were, that might be a useful additional piece of information. And with that, thank you again very much for the opportunity. I welcome any questions at the end during the Q&A. I see that there's been some coming in. And feel free to check out the GTD website. You can follow us on Twitter. And if you have any other follow-up questions, I welcome any emails you have.
Excellent, Erin. Thank you so much for that very thorough presentation. I think it was excellent. So we do have several questions, but before we get specifically to the questions, and I believe you answered at least one of them, which was, how do you classify the January 6th attack? Thank you very much for doing that. I want to turn it over to Paige to talk a little bit more about what intelligence and analysis at DHS does with this kind of information, and how do you use it, and then how do you pass it to people who are responsible for responding? So Paige, you're on mute.
Got it. So thank you everyone so much for allowing me to come and speak today. As Maureen said, I am an analyst currently with the Department of Homeland Security and Terrorism Mission Center. But prior to that, and most of my career, a majority of it, has been spent on the state and local level, working for either state level Homeland Security entities or emergency management agencies. And over that time, I've had the opportunity to fill a variety of positions, whether it's on the analyst level or in a management position. But one thing has remained pretty consistent, which is my use of the GTD for help in both intelligence production, briefing, creation of my own data sets, and advising junior analysts. So my first gig ever in this field, I worked as a counterterrorism analyst for the state of New Jersey. On my first day, I was assigned a portfolio. I had emergency services sector, white supremacists, and Hezbollah. So it's quite the unique kind of portfolio I was given. And I remember being really overwhelmed. I didn't really know anything about terrorism. I knew ISIS was on the news, and that was about it. So my supervisor and mentor mentioned to me to, if you want to kind of poke around, go and start at the GTD. And that's what I did. And I don't know if Erin had a chance to mention it, but you can download the whole data set. And that's what I prefer to do because I like to make my own pivot tables and play with the data. A true nerd, I like to see all of the information. Although I do find kind of the trend portion on the website helpful as well. But with a few pivot tables, I was able to understand Hezbollah's attack numbers globally and really kind of focus in on the fact that they had never conducted an attack in the homeland, which ultimately led me to be able to consider other ways in which they could impact the state of New Jersey through criminal activity or surveillance or other things like that. And as a junior analyst, whenever I was assigned a new terrorist group or sector or tactic, one of my first stops was always to the GTD. Most of my career has focused really in the homeland. What do kind of international and global terrorist threats mean to us? And the GTD has always allowed me to gain that perspective about what other Western nations are experiencing and how that compared to the United States. So beyond helping me kind of develop subject matter expertise, I continue to find the GTD very helpful when providing briefs to leadership. So very often as intel analysts, you'll be asked to either brief a product or brief an ongoing threat issue to leadership or to the customers that you work with. And I always make sure I go to the GTD before a brief and check out just kind of the context behind a group. How many attacks have they conducted over time, as well as are there any kind of new recent developments that I should highlight? Because sometimes you're briefing areas and subject matters that you're not always experts in. You're not always super familiar with it. So going to the GTD allows me to save research time and allows me to provide that context to leadership that I anticipate them asking for. And also everyone knows the GTD. So there's a level of kind of credibility there when speaking to those numbers and statistics. And often, as an analyst, sometimes you can be wearing a bunch of hats, right? Much like any other job, but particularly on the state and local level, I found that, resources and time were always strapped. So sometimes our analysis would begin off the data collection that START had provided to us, which was really helpful for us in saving time. So as I gained more experience in the CT realm, I began to move beyond just appreciating the global terrorism database's data and really began to value its methodology and particularly its code book. I don't know if Erin had a chance to mention, but there's a code book, a lengthy one that sits behind the GTD. So if you want to know, every explanation of the variables that they consider, which variables are binary and which, you can enter text into. There's so much kind of detail in those code books. And there's been needs throughout my career to create my own internal data sets, whether that's, a listing of all plots in the United States or a listing of kind of non-ideologically motivated mass violence. And I would always begin by going to, definitely cheating, going to START's code book and taking a look to see what those variables were. And not just the GTD, but also START has a variety of other databases. Pyrus and TVIS come to mind. And I've always gone and kind of looked at those variables to determine what I should incorporate into mine as well. And I've advocated for my more junior analysts to do the same. In terms of challenges of using the GTD, as Erin mentioned, definitions of terrorism, definitions of ideology differ throughout the intelligence community. So it differs between agencies, the government differs from state and local level in terms of federal versus state and local, as well as kind of, I think, nonprofits or think tanks. It's all kind of all over the place. So always with the understanding that when I'm using the GTD data, that I'm going to need to put it in the context of whatever agency I'm working for, whatever their thresholds are. And increasingly, counterterrorism has become a bit more complicated, right? We're looking at kind of black extremism. We're looking at instances of protest-related violence where the ideology might be there, but it's not super clear. So there's always a need to kind of interpret that data. So I see that as a bit of a challenge. And also, I'm definitely greedy. And if I could have, START and the Global Terrorism Database produce kind of real-time and a kind of real-time update that data set, that would be preferable. There's definitely been instances where I would rely on the GTD up until, the most recent publication, and then need to pull my own data in as well and kind of keep track for the current year. So, selfishly, I would love it to be available right away. In sum, START's GTD has saved me a ton of time throughout my career. Again, well-respected institution, and you feel comfortable including that as sourcing in your briefings and in your production. And the last point that I'll leave you with is that START has always been very open to collaboration with practitioners like myself. They do not operate in an academic vacuum. I think they're always interested in how practitioners and customers are using the data that they collect and how they can fine-tune that system to benefit their customers, which I think is really important. But that concludes my presentation. Thanks for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Paige. That was very helpful, and it was very good to hear the specific application of the GTD and intelligence. Mike, give us a little bit of Nevada CISA perspective on these issues.
You bet. So first, very much like my colleague Paige from DHS, we use the GTB extensively. One, to look at what are patterns and trends in global terrorism and how they can apply locally. But we also look at, as Paige indicated, for those gaps. What haven't they done yet? And we try to focus our efforts on really thinking about what could be the next black swan. And if we could have imagined 9/11 on 9/9 and 9/10, we would have had 9/11 in theory. And so if we can start thinking about new ways that they haven't used before, and how it applies here locally in Nevada, then we can start getting in front of that. If we can start finding new ways that they're attacking infrastructure. And just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And if we can think about it, then we can start planning towards it and start putting capabilities and protective measures in place. And that's one of the things that we're doing on a local level. We're meeting with law enforcement agencies and city agencies and public works agencies at a very, very small granular level to talk to them about ways that infrastructure can be broken and ways that our lifelines can be impacted. And it doesn't have to mean that a group of 6 people with ski masks on storm the wastewater treatment facility and take it over. While that is indeed a potential possibility, there are other ways to break choke points in our lifelines and ways to break redundancies and reduce our resilience and make it very difficult for things to be repaired in a timely manner in the midst of a blizzard where the impacts become much more felt and much harder felt by the public and public officials, so they can push their agenda further. So when we sit down with our public agencies and our law enforcement agencies, whether it's a public works or it's a local police department or it's a state threat assessment or a threat analysis center, we're having these discussions and trying to find up new ways to break our systems and then coming up with ways to implement protective measures for those potentially broken systems.
Excellent, Mike. That's really helpful. And that sort of dovetails nicely into one of the questions we've got, which is basically to Erin and well, to all 3 of you, but I'll start with Erin. How do you classify attacks or virtual technology attacks versus the loss of human life? How does that fall into the definition of terrorism? And how would you classify something that potentially would be an attack that was solely online and didn't involve, dead bodies in the street? Is that something you will pick up, and is that in the database?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So it's a very important question. We've given a lot of thought to it. I can tell you how we address that now, which is the definition of terrorism that we have is based on the assumption of some sort of kinetic violence, right? And that there's an actual physical act of violence. And so if someone used virtual tactics to produce a physical act of violence, for example, if you hack into a air traffic control system and cause planes to crash or something like that. If there's a sort of virtual tactic that results in physical violence, we would include that in the database. We have not seen many of those situations at all. I think maybe we have two that could be characterized like that. One was a suspected attack, and it's a borderline inclusion case that we make a note about in the database as well, where someone hacked into an oil pipeline and increased the pressure and caused an explosion. And it was sort of a virtual tactic that resulted in a physical action. So that type of thing we would include, but we don't really see any of them at all, because it's probably much easier to just make a bomb in many cases. And so the other type of tactic, though, is where it's entirely virtual, right? You cause a great deal of harm, but it's not physical harm. That we would not include. So that wouldn't be included in the global terrorism database. It's a really interesting challenge. I think that a lot of the people who work on the GTD would be sort of interested in trying to figure out a strategy for capturing that type of information, but it is just a very different type of information from the physical attacks that were set up to capture in the GTD. So you can imagine the sources of that kind of information are very different, right? The types of sources that have reliable information on that sort of event are very different from the types of sources that we use for the media sources that we use. So in some cases it's reported in the media, but very rarely, I think, compared to the number of situations where a cyber attack takes place. And then the types of information that you would capture about that are very different from the types of information that we would capture about physical attacks, right? So it's in many ways a different data structure that you would be trying to capture. But I agree, it's sort of it's certainly an important type of harm that we probably don't do enough to have systematic data collection on. It's a really big challenge.
Excellent. Mike Page, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with Erin. From my perspective in particular, we're interested in kind of the physical kinetic attacks and ramifications. That said, we're always going to be interested in cyber sophistication of different terrorist groups and terrorist actors, what the intent of that is, whether, it's to fundraise or to gather information or to create, kind of ISIS kill lists from stolen, personally identifiable information. All of those things are certainly of interest to us, that we see them, less often, certainly, than the physical attack aspect.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to add a question before we get to two that are specific about specific regions. Erin, you mentioned that you have students working on the GTD. We have our high school students with us today, and I hoped you would be able to give a quick answer about how they could be part of this if they were interested.
Yeah, absolutely. So our internships are. We have a really robust internship program. It's something that we're very proud of. It's for university students, so it would be something that our high school students should be sort of looking out for when they go to college, if they're interested in. And you can take a look at the START website. There's a lot of information about the internship opportunities on the START website. We just oriented our new group of spring 2021 interns last week, and we're very excited to have them. And I think it's important to note that the students who work on our project work on the research process, right? They work on the data collection. They're not there for, filing and stapling and busy work. They're very engaged in all of our discussions about how to handle tricky cases and things like that. So I do think it's a good experience, and I encourage anyone who's interested, when you find yourself in college and are interested in joining us, to check out the START website and look at the semesterly internship opportunities.
Excellent. We will send that link out to Richard Clark from our school district partner, and make sure that it gets out to our students so they can be thinking about that as they are looking at college opportunities. Thank you for
I'll
that.
also add just very quickly that many of our full-time staff members started out as interns on our project.
Ah, even better.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we will follow up with you on that. So then very specific question about the regional data. First one is in the Afghanistan data, obviously there's appears to be what is a seasonal pattern to it, which has historically been attributed to weather. But when you look at those patterns, do you get any more insights regarding what the perpetrators are doing? Are they moving around, going back to their home bases during the winter? Are they identifiable so that you can tell what's going on? So do you have any more insight than just it's weather?
I don't have a lot. I agree that the seasonal pattern in Afghanistan is very well recognized. A lot has been written about it. It's known as the spring fighting season.
Right.
That is a time where these groups are carrying out more attacks, but also deadlier attacks. I think is probably the big. When you look at the pattern, the sharpest impact of the pattern is on the lethality of the attacks rather than simply the number of attacks itself. I don't have, unfortunately, a lot more detail to offer about sort of the mechanics of that and what is going on behind the scenes with respect to individual patterns of movement.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Second question is specific for Iraq and Syria, but I will expand it out. How do you classify or how do you address those organizations that have government affiliation in terms of, do you count them as terrorism? And the specific question was about the Quds Force in Iraq and Syria. Do they count as government entities? Do they count as terrorist organizations? When there's a lot of gray area in there, what do you do with those?
That's another really great question, and it's a tough one in some contexts, to be fair. So the database itself does not include attacks by state actors.
Okay.
So
and
it is. So that's an important sort of baseline. That's not to say that attacks by state actors are less important or less reprehensible or anything like that. It's just a decision in terms of an academic definition of terrorism that focuses on sort of the asymmetric aspect of the control over the use of force, for example. So the database generally doesn't include attacks by state actors. We do not make any determinations about state-sponsored attacks, right? So if a state is funding an organization, is providing resources, is providing safe haven, we would not exclude an attack based on that because it was state-sponsored. We just exclude the attacks that are carried out by actual agents of the state, actors who are state employees, to sort of put it simply. There are many contexts where it is actually difficult to tell who those people are and the extent to which an organization is an agent of the state or not. There are a lot of different contexts in which it's really difficult to know. And our goal in all of these situations is to try and make as consistent as possible decisions that we can, right? And look for indications of gathering the best information we know, but then also communicating that to in the database, right? We don't try to sort of dumb things down and oversimplify things. We try and have a lot of ability to capture ambiguity. So I mentioned before that that pipeline attack is flagged as a sort of ambiguous case. The reason for that is because it's not clear who did it. It was an attack that I think the PKK initially claimed responsibility for because it was a pipeline bombing, and that they have a history of pipeline bombings. But then when it came out that it was a potential cyber attack, there was some reporting that said only a government has the capacity to do this, to carry out that attack. And when we have any situations that are ambiguous like that, we have a specific variable in the data set for the nerds in GTD usage land called doubt terrorism proper. And that is a flag that we we use will mark it as doubt terrorism proper if there's any kind of ambiguity over whether or not it meets any of the individual definitional pieces that we require. And that allows users to know that they can either include or exclude those. If they want sort of a broader net, they can include those ambiguous cases. But if they want sort of a very, a stricter, more conservative set of information about the cases where the information is more clear and more explicit, then they can exclude any cases that are classified as doubt terrorism proper in the database.
Excellent. Great. Thanks. So I do want to ask a sort of a final question, and then I'll get to my very final question. So the final question is really about, are you able to glean from your research, and perhaps this goes back to Paige and Mike, both analysis on top of the GTD analysis, are you able to glean sort of compounding factors? So you gave that nice chart, Erin, where you had Al-Qaeda and you had Islamic State. Can you see interconnections? Can you, does the research allow you to be able to show indications? And I guess I'm specifically asking in the context of what you said was your new T2V focus on the United States. So are you able to see collaborations, coordination, synergies between groups changing from one to another? How do you get out of the little individual boxes of, this group does this and this group does that, and see how that works? And I imagine that, right now, particularly what we're living through, the synergies in the Homeland are something that we're all very interested in.
Yeah, that's a really great question. In fact, that question is sort of close to my heart because it's been part of my personal research agenda for a while now. There are limitations to our ability to do that using the GTD as it is now. Right now, we can record up to 3 perpetrator organizations for each individual attack. So to a small extent, you can see if there are organizations that are both attributed responsibility for the same attack. That would indicate perhaps some collaboration, but it could also indicate that there's competing information about which of those groups is responsible for the attack. So you can get at that a little bit, but that is one of the things that we hope to improve upon in terms of gathering greater movement data, right? I talked about sort of, and that effort was born out of our frustration when people ask us questions and say, what is Islamic State doing? And we have to sort of start with, well, it depends on what you count as part of Islamic State in terms of the core group and these broader networks. And so we started doing a lot more work on collecting and sort of gathering this broader movement information. And that's something that we absolutely hope to do more of. I've done a little bit of it on the historical data going back to 1970. So we have some of that done where we have these sort of broader movements networked together. And by movement, I mean, it's not as broad as an ideology. It's organizations that sort of share the same goal but are distinct, and then also including in that individuals who aren't necessarily formally affiliated with an organization but also share that ideology, which has been important, particularly lately, because we're seeing more of these attacks where unaffiliated individuals are carrying out attacks sort of inspired by the broader group's goals. So a little bit now, but that's definitely one of our priorities moving forward.
Excellent, great. So then now I'm just going to tee up the last question, which is in your context and from the terrorism perspective, the sometimes trivial but often important question: what keeps you up at night? And I'm gonna to Erin, I'm gonna ask you to talk, to address that in the context of global terrorism trends. Paige, sort of in the Homeland context, and Mike, in the context of Nevada. So Erin, I'll start with you.
What keeps me up at night? I think in a lot of it, so I might have 2 answers to the question. One is a more pragmatic one, which is, maintaining a project like this going into the future. It's a fairly major effort. Paige mentions the desire to have more real-time data. We share that desire greatly. And you know, to be honest, we've been struggling with this lately in terms of there's a lot of competing priorities, there's a lot of competing concerns and challenges, and then it's sort of in some cases a scarcity of resources to devote to sort of ongoing issues related to terrorism. And so that's one of the things that I worry about, that you know, a lot of the news has sort of died away from, for example, the Islamic State activity was just so profoundly horrific in you know, 2013, 2014, 2015, and because that has declined somewhat, I think there's less attention being paid to it, but it is still quite terrible, and there's still, you know, that activity and the broader context that Islamic State is active in, and they're spread throughout you know, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. I think that we should continue to make sure that we are being informed about those new developments.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. Paige.
Yes, this is a tough question. I certainly, you know, agree with Erin in terms of kind of putting all of our eggs in one basket. I think we have a tendency to kind of over-focus or shift all of our resources, you know, to one kind of area or one ideology in light of certain attacks. But, you know, you can never stop paying attention to all of these groups, because it takes one attack for them to become very relevant again, you know, to the media and to government officials and agencies. In terms of kind of the domestic landscape, obviously, great attention is being paid currently to the storming of the Capitol. A variety of different ideologies were involved, judging from different kind of FBI reports and investigations. And I know that they have hundreds of other cases that they are investigating as well, that was provided open source to the media. In terms of the ideologies that were represented there, there's kind of conspiracy theory folks, you know, some QAnon folks, as well as different kind of militia extremist organizations and white supremacist organizations. So I think of always a concern is kind of these ideologies coming together. In what ways are they similar? In what ways are they different? There's a lot of uncertainty in terms of kind of next steps for some of these individuals. What do kind of social media removals mean? You know, does it mean that law enforcement and different government agencies have kind of oversight of what these folks are doing? Or, you know, much like we saw with ISIS and different Salafi jihadist groups, does that mean that now that might disrupt the network and really disrupt kind of the planning and communication? I think that remains to be seen. So I think those are kind of some of the big challenges that we're going to moving into 2021 with.
Excellent. Thank you, Paige. Mike, you get the last word.
You bet. So there's several things we can focus on, and I guess I'm going to be very, very focused on what I can talk about here. So I think one of the things that we're concerned about is those groups that Paige mentioned, taking it to the next step, and coordinated kinetic attacks on critical infrastructure, particularly choke points, and that surrounds, when you talk about choke points of coordinated attacks, you're talking about insider threats and those types of things. So the people who feel that their voice has been silenced and can no longer voice their opinions or voice their disagreement with things are finding themselves or express themselves, they're left with no other option. And so when they get to that step, I see the thing that concerns me is a lot of talk and rhetoric actually being put into operational practice, and us seeing kinetic attacks on the homeland, whether it's public official assassination attempts, whether it's another national style bombing going against 5G, or maybe just taking out a government symbolic target like a state capitol or a courthouse or something along those lines, even if it's done in the dead of the night. Reno is not immune to those. We had the attempted attack of the IRS building decades ago, where they parked a Ryder truck outside of it, but he didn't know what he was doing. It didn't go off. But he did it in the middle of the night, so he didn't kill anybody. He just wanted the building gone so they would stop their operation in northern Nevada. Those types of attacks, and I that is a very big concerning point for me, because as Paige alluded to, it's very difficult in talking to a lot of my counterparts in law enforcement and in that world. It's difficult for us to not us, but it's difficult for them who are involved in intelligence and investigations to kind of see what's happening and monitor those ongoing investigations. Signal, which is a encrypted, this Signal is an encrypted app for communications. It broke over this past weekend, and it went down across the state, across the Western United States and some other pocket areas because of surge of users. Telegram, there was a open source news article this morning that Telegram has gone up 25 million users since Facebook shut down a lot of these things. And so we're seeing that a lot of these communications that were out in the open on Facebook and Twitter and Parler, et cetera, have now gone underground, so to speak, on encrypted channels. And so it's going to be much harder for law enforcement to get in front of potentially some kinetic attacks. And that remains my big concern.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've got lots of information, addressed as many questions as we possibly can. And I thank you all for a very insightful presentation. For NSFers who are still on, our next program will be on the 25th of February, and it will be a first look at the Biden administration national security strategy. And the presenters will be our very own Keith Hansen and Ray Hofstetler. They'll be digging through what the Biden administration strategies are that they can understand and comparing that to how that looked in previous administrations. And there will be a special focus on the nuclear strategy. So we'll be returning more back towards state actors. In March, our program will be, I believe, the 24th. I have to confirm that, so watch the website. And it will be on energy security. And we will be doing that again in partnership with the CNA Military Advisory Board. So we hope to see you all in upcoming programs. Stay tuned. I'll be posting things on the website. To Erin, Paige, and Mike, thank you very much for a very stimulating discussion. I really appreciate your input, and I look forward to hearing more about the T2V project as it moves forward, Erin. So perhaps you can come back later in the year and tell us what you found. So with that, take care, everybody. Stay safe. For the Northern Nevadans, don't go on the roads, and we will see you shortly. Take care. Bye-bye.